For hundreds of years, the travelling fair has brought a carnival of joy to towns across Britain. Rides like the Dodgems, Waltzer and Dive Bomber that thrilled us.
I can remember going on that ride and on the first dip being totally convinced that I was about to be killed. Absolutely convinced.
Exotic and bizarre shows that amazed us.
I used to stand like that and open my mouth and they'd put that in my mouth, and that was called the kiss of death.
The fairground even had its own unique taste.
There's somebody with a candy floss which is bigger than your head. So you're eating the stuff which is sticking around your face. You emerge plastered in sticky pink sugar.
Out here in the fields, I found my meals.
And the fair has always been a place to showcase the latest innovations in popular entertainment.
The fair has been the catalyst or the crucible for all forms of modern entertainment that you think of. In the 1890s, they brought the cinematograph. Professional boxing as a sport came from the fairground. Even something like bingo owes its origins to the fairground.
On the yellow, 35, 3 and 5, 35 yellow.
But behind the bright lights and candy floss, the fairground has also been a place on the edges of society where excitement and danger await.
And you have sort of unholy alliance between youth and bright lights and things going fast and popular music.
Sally, take my hand. We'll travel south across land. Put out the fire and don't look past my shoulder.
No wonder the arrival of the travelling fair sparks such a special kind of magic in us.
The ears are pounding with the beat of the popular music. The lights are flashing on the Ghost Ride, the Dodgems. Everything is heading towards a massive sensory overload that can carry you away into another dimension of being, a realm of transcendence, a place of beauty, not quite tranquility, but certainly a place of maybe.
Teenage wasteland. It's only teenage wasteland. Teenage wasteland.
The amazing Batgirl, yes, she's alive, ladies and gentlemen. The first time at your fair. The head of a girl, the body of a bat. Not a wax model there, by not a mechanical figure.
In grey 1950s Britain, the fairground offered a rare glimpse of the exotic. As people flocked to see an array of lurid illusions known as sideshows.
She is real, she is alive, young and beautiful. She is the legendary princess, on the inside depicted in living flesh and living form.
I've loved going to fairgrounds ever since I was a tiny child, and at those times there were show rows of sideshows, and it's that part rather than the rides that really interested me. The wonderful row of colour and excitement of the people outside trying to get you into their show. The biggest rat in the world, why men leave home, a girl in a bubble bath, of course.
Alive and real and waiting to meet you on the inside is the smallest, the most intelligent and the most charming little man that you've ever laid eyes upon in your life.
I was born in Ireland in the town of Lisburn, 8 miles from Belfast. My father, mother, brothers, sisters were all Norman persons. I'm the only one in the family who never grew up. I'm a leprechaun from Ireland. Now, if there's any questions...
3 key ingredients were needed to attract the public to these sideshows. A bizarre story, a sense of horror, and a touch of sex.
Horror or sex? That seems to be right down the show row, all the way down. Everybody is getting very close together now. We're getting horror and sex in together. I've said I will gamble to put a show on with just girl on the front of it, big question mark, will take money.
To present to you the famous dance, some people call striptease. Now, we call it art, grace and beauty. Because
now, if you were 12 years old, a boy in the 1950s, there were no page 3s, so you wanted to see a girl, and notice they were all girls in those shows. The headless lady, the girl in the goldfish bowl, the living half lady, they were all girls, all performing in those shows. So sex was an important ingredient, of course.
the young lady will take you around the world, take you down through Cape Paris. She'll finally finish up in the Garden of Eden as Eve.
I can remember my brother urging me, pushing me to go in and see The Invisible Woman.
Step right forward. She is alive and on view the moment you enter the door.
Two dozen of us were pushed into this room, and there was a woman in a bikini. The mad professor would come on, pull a switch, and suddenly she'd disappear. There'd be crackling, oh, where's she gone? We must bring her back. Oh no, the electrons have gone wrong. And then there'd be a crackling and a pushing, and then suddenly she'd shimmer into view again and disappear. Apparently it was technology brought from Russia.
Drawing a crowd to this kind of attraction was a fine art performed by the showman, a figure who had been orchestrating all the fun of the fair since the Victorian era.
Gentlemen, when the 7th and last veil falls, she will make the shirts on your backs fly up and down, just like a Venetian blind. The hair upon your very head will stand out straight, like the bristles on a porcupine's back.
The showman's a quintessentially Victorian figure. He's the person who runs the business of the fairground. He's the one who searches for the acts. He's the one who books the acts. And he is a figure of great authority. He's a kind of artistic figure, but a commercial one too.
Woman and child shall see this most remarkable, thrilling and sensational exhibition.
The showman was, I suppose, like the music hall proprietor in the Victorian times.
Have you done any wrestling, son? You look a bit small to me. Come up here a moment, let's have a look at you.
He was a manager and an entrepreneur and an innovator, but he was also an actor. He had a persona that he would adopt. So the showman was often on the front of the show, calling people in, telling them about the attractions that they would see inside.
You will stand back in wonder and amazement. You may not believe it at first, but it's there before your very eyes. Now, don't worry on the outside.
The showman had emerged in the 19th century as fairgrounds began to develop into the popular entertainment industry we recognise today. The most famous showman of the Victorian era was Tom Norman.
I think he was a charismatic personality. If there is a wonderful photograph of him where he has a shiny topper and a very sharp moustache, and he's brandishing his gavel because he was not only a showman but an auctioneer. And the auctioneer and the showman have a lot in common. They have to be able to talk. And I guess that was one of Tom Norman's great qualities, that he could talk up an act just as he would talk up the material that he was going to sell in his auction.
Norman captured the imagination of Victorian fairgoers by displaying human oddities with extraordinary talents in what became known as the freak show.
The appeal of the freak show has been there since the Middle Ages, and the fairground freak has been there since the Middle Ages. And by freak show, I mean the sort of display of human oddity or human curiosity, somebody who was different physically.
Norman would intrigue fairground audiences by concocting an incredible story for each freak show he mounted.
And so this was never the person who had a dreadful skin disease. This was somebody who was born like this because their mother had touched an alligator. Jojo, the dog-faced boy covered in hair. He was the dog-faced boy because his mother was frightened by a dog when she was pregnant. This was an accepted medical term. It was called maternal impression.
Spinning a tale to attract the curiosity of Victorian fairgoers was Norman's stock in trade.
He kind of advertised Jacko the talking fish, which of course is a sea lion. He would advertise these fish that could play the pianoforte, and he would advertise anything. And it was always the latest wonder of the age. But his motto always was, it was not the show, but the tale that he told. His famous one, I would say, was John Chambers' Lion's Wonder. Now, the whole thing about the freak show attractions or the sideshow or the curiosity attractions is you didn't just go and look at somebody. You looked at somebody who had a talent or a skill. So you'd see them doing what is to us everyday normal things, but to them is extraordinary. So John Chambers, the armless wonder, would actually be a carpenter with his feet. So all of these people would actually have a particular skill which they'd learnt through adversity because there was no other way of making a living.
Although shocking to modern sensibilities, the fairground freak shows offered a secure income to those with disabilities or deformities.
I think that when we look back on the 19th century and that culture of the exhibition of human oddities, we lump all these people together as though they were just a sort of people who'd had no individual existences. But really these people were celebrities. You know, you could buy little carte de visites of them. You could put their pictures on your mantelpiece. People like the dwarf performers, Charles Stratton, General Might, Tom Thumb. These were among some of the most famous people in Europe and America. You know, they were not cringing victims locked up in the back rooms of shops. They were ubiquitous in 19th century culture.
There was often more to freak shows than simple exploitation, even for the most famous act of the time, Joseph Merrick, who would become known as the Elephant Man.
You know, when we think about entertainers like Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man, who was managed by Tom Norman, I mean, the great British showman, you know, we think of Merrick as being this kind of cringing victim of a cruel system.
Our understanding of the plight of the Elephant Man comes largely from a fictionalised account of his life, which was brought to the screen by filmmaker David Lynch.
Ladies and gentlemen, the terrible Elephant Man. Stand up.
Stand up!
We see the film by David Lynch, and we see that showman figure, Bites, who's drunk, who beats the guy, whips him, keeps him in the most terrible condition.
Bites, don't!
Where have you been?
Well, actually, Lynch had to invent that character, Bites, because in real life he never existed. And the accounts we have, the dominant account of the life of Merrick, comes from the Dr. Frederick Treves, you know, Anthony Hopkins in the movie. And this is not a very accurate account of his life. Treves doesn't even get the man's name right. In the film and in Treves' book he's called John Merrick. In real life he was called Joseph Merrick. He was on what most modern entertainers would find a pretty good deal. He was on a 50-50 box office split with Tom Norman. You can see Merrick as a victim if you want. You could also see him as a man who has managed to find a way of making his physical extraordinariness into a way of making a living, a way of having a place and an existence in the world.
Throughout the Victorian era, freak shows continued to draw crowds at fairs across Britain. But people also went to the fair to experience the first rides, which had emerged at the beginning of the 19th century. These early rides were built from wood and powered by hand or pulled by ponies. They would soon be transformed by the invention of steam power in the second half of the 19th century.
The 19th century fairs are kind of divided into two areas, the kind of pre-industrial and the post-industrial. And the Industrial Revolution hits the fair a lot later than people realise. It's about the 1860s. And actually in 1861 at Bolton New Year Fair, when Thomas Hurst brought a steam-powered roundabout. So what they did was bring the latest modern aspect of the Industrial Revolution, steam power, into an old fairground ride, which was a kind of would be a hand-turned roundabout, put them together, and we get what's called the merry-go-round. So the British invented the merry-go-round, the classic roundabout that we see all over the world now.
At first, these steam-powered merry-go-rounds were run by an engine which was fixed to the outside of the ride. This technology was improved by an engineer from King's Lynn, Frederick Savage.
He went to a show in his native Norfolk and saw there a small fairground ride that was being powered by a steam engine. Now, it is said that Frederick Savage looked at this and thought, I know how I can do the job better. And what he did, and this was the most important thing about it, was that instead of having the steam engine outside the ride, he put it at the centre of the ride, hence the term centre engine.
Savage's innovation would mean bigger and more ornate rides could be built, carrying more people, and as a result, his fairground business became one of the largest in Britain.
His workforce increased to about 400, and he was producing rides for showmen the length and breadth of the country. None of the designs that he built were, in a sense, original to him, but he was a great one for taking other people's ideas and making them work. And this succession of rides that he built from the 1870s onwards became the star attractions at the fairs in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. First you had the galloping horses, then there were the switchback rides, and they were the grand rides of the fairground. And the razzle-dazzle, a rather strange machine which spun round and tilted as it did so. And it was the sort of ride that was described in its day as a oncer. You went on it once and never again.
It would have been quite atmospheric, really, lots of steam. The centre engine would have been mounted on a gantry. So it would have been a lot of hard work as well, because you would have had to stoke the boiler and get steam up, power to produce the power to drive the thing round. You would have had an organ playing as well, a paper organ, a barrel organ, so you would have had the sort of military, waltzes and marches, that sort of thing. So you had a bit of an industrial noise from the steam engines, and then the sort of entertainment element really was the organ music.
And some local authorities banned them because they thought they were like Satan's inferno, because of the noise. And they were quite dangerous at one point, because there was no way people didn't realise just how fast these rides could go. And a really powerful steam roundabout from the 19th century with steam power at full speed is quite a scary thing. And nowadays, when you see the modern steam fairs, they don't really, they're quite gentle and old people go in them. But at the time, they're the white knuckle ride of their day.
Beginning with these new steam-powered rides, the Victorian Fairground was at the forefront of industrial and technological innovation.
By the end of the 19th century, the fairground has become as much a showcase of Victorian technology as the Crystal Palace or a trade fair. The same technologies that are transforming Britain's communications and travel systems, the same technologies that are sending steamships out across the world and creating advances in armaments, all sorts of stuff, they're also transforming how Victorians have a night out. They get into these devices that hurl them about at great speeds, and steam is at the heart of it.
By the end of the 19th century, the people who ran Britain's travelling fairs had become recognised as a distinct community.
The showman will tell you that show people are born, not made, but this kind of crucible of the 19th century, the mid-19th century, you got people coming, you had people coming from Ireland, you had some aspects of the travelling community coming in, you had people who were theatrical people, strolling players, and becomes this crucible of mixing everything in until they become the showman.
Unlike other popular entertainments that emerged in the Victorian era, like the circus, the travelling fair has traditionally been the domain of a closed community.
I think the difference, my family and people always said, the difference between the circus and the fair is that you can run away to the circus, but you can't run away to the fair. So it's this closed community, which was described in the 19th century as a village on wheels.
But despite the popularity of the travelling fairs, the fairground community were often viewed with suspicion and hostility. These negative attitudes towards travelling people were a hangover of stereotypes which date back to the medieval era.
I think there is a mistrust in, and it still exists, for all travelling people. You do have this sort of influx of foreigners, as it were, and foreigner, by that I mean people from other parts of the country. It was then, therefore, easy to blame them for things that happened in the town. So, for instance, towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, show people were blamed for spreading disease. They were thought of as being the carriers of measles. So measles epidemics were often based on, oh, well, there were fair people in the town, they must have been the carriers. And so it was therefore easy of saying, well, we don't want these people in our town. And the great and the good often did do that.
This hostility led to a proposal in Parliament that the fairground community should face limits on their ability to travel around the country. In response to the bill, the leading showmen of the era met to defend their transient lifestyle.
A meeting was called at the Black Lion Hotel in Salford, attended by the leading lights of the day, Pat Collins, the Studds, the Whites from Scotland, and so on. And they agreed that they would form a group to be known as the United Kingdom Van Dwellers Protection Association. And its aim was to oppose and hopefully defeat this bill that was being proposed in Parliament. It took them 4 years to do it, but eventually they made enough friends in both houses of Parliament to have this bill kicked out.
This group was renamed the Showman's Guild of Great Britain and would now represent the community who ran Britain's fairgrounds.
It's a very effective organisation, but it was there firstly to protect the organisation of the showman, but then it was there to protect the fairs. And it's still very effective.
These showmen would orchestrate the showcasing of the latest technological innovations of the age. In the final years of the 19th century, Victorians raced to the fair to wonder at the marvel of the cinema. It was on the fairground that this most important cultural invention was first widely shown.
And the cinematograph was shown in February 1897 at King's Lynn Fair, but also in December 1896 at the Royal Agricultural Hall at the World's Fair. And it was classed as the wonder of the age, the dawn of modern life. And people loved it because what the showmen did, they would go to the town a week before, make a film, and then show it at the fair and say, come and see yourselves on the screen, showing 10 shows a day. They showed continuous film shows every 15 minutes. They brought films from all over the world. They commissioned titles. Méliès, Parfait, all the big filmmakers, all the big film companies sold direct to the showmen. You would have 14 cinematograph shows at Hull Fair alone in 1901. One after another. And the people screamed for this wonderful new attraction. And it wasn't until 1909 that permanent cinemas were built. So for the first 13 years of its life, cinema belonged to the fairground and was born on the fairground.
Into the first decade of the 20th century, Britain's industrial heartlands were expanding, and these growing urban communities demanded popular entertainment. In areas like South Wales, it was the travelling fair that was the first to meet this demand.
Something that could burst into the town and like a rocket, explode all over it. These were very much workaday towns, workaday villages, terraces, particularly in the South Wales coalfields, springing up overnight. They didn't, at this stage, let's say 1890s, early 1900s, particularly have the later workmen's institutes and libraries and gymnasiums. They didn't necessarily have music hall theatres. The Empire in Tonypandy is opened in 1909. What they did have, therefore, breaking into their workaday existence, were the traditional aspects of working class life, even from rural working class life, and that is festivals and feast days, or in this instance, the coming of the fair.
In these communities, working men were drawn to the fairground boxing booths, where they could challenge the showmen's prize fighters.
You'd have guys coming off night shifts. You'd have ready money to spend, because these were young, very fit colliers by and large. This was a very masculine kind of society. And they would arrive and they would see, let's say, Black Jack Scarrett's boxing booth, and Black Jack would have his picked men parading in front of the crowd. He would say, my man here will have his hands tied behind his back. And if anybody can land a blow on him within a minute, here's a golden guinea. Now, a golden guinea, that was a lot of money. I mean, just to hit this guy whose hands are tied behind his back. And you must have fancied your chances, because you could be up against somebody who was, say, 7 stone or even less, soaking wet, like little Jimmy Wilde. And you're 5'10" or even 5'8". You're 10 stone, you're 12 stone, you're a collier. Of course you're going to knock this guy out, only you don't.
Fighters like Jimmy Wilde and fellow Welshman Jim Driscoll emerged from the fairground boxing booths to become world champions in their own right, and were later inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame.
I think the classic boxing story in terms of the boxing booth would be Jimmy Wilde. Jimmy Wilde, born in 1892, growing up in the Rhondda, a tiny man, very long arms, not somebody you would have ever imagined could be a boxer. But of course, in that time, in that place, and with his physical fitness and his stamina, he soon was. And he naturally would have gravitated towards the boxing booth, and very quickly proved himself, despite looking tiny and sickly, as an expert knockout artist. And that's the key, of course, with Wilde, was that he could knock people out by a combination of, technique and efficiency. And yet, at the same time, if you saw him, you think you'd have a good chance. One Easter bank holiday in Jack Scarrett's booths in Swansea, he knocked 22 men out. And in Wilde's case, very rapidly, this boxing booth phenomenon, 1900s to 1908, 1909, was going to gravitate towards the growing professionalization of the sport and the ability of working men like Wilde to become, by 1916, champion of the world, which he remains until 1922, but out, absolutely straight out of the boxing booth.
The boxing booths eventually declined as the sport began to become fully professional. But these fighters from the fair established much of what is modern boxing today.
All the elements that you see in modern boxing today are from the fair. The way that the people come onto the ring, the way they issue the challenge, the whole showmanship, are you ready to rumble? That's just like roll up, roll up. And I think the reason why boxing as a sport actually also has this kind of weird reputation is because of those showman aspects of it, the showman roots. People don't think of it as a sport, they think of it as entertainment.
After the First World War, the fairground entered a new modern age with the introduction of electricity.
What's interesting, the Victorian age and then the Edwardian age is kind of known as the golden age of the fairground. But what I find fascinating is the next form of transformation, which is the 1920s, and I call it the push-button fair, where suddenly you get the electric fair. The fair becomes modern, sleek. You get the waltzer, which is a ride that every generation thinks is theirs. In the 1920s, it's Mr. Jackson's waltzing cars. Now, how mundane does that sound? In the 1950s, it's the rock and roll waltzer. In the 1970s, it's the disco waltzer. In the 1980s, it's the rave machine. What an amazing ride. The same ride has been exciting children or people or teenagers for over 80 years.
The invention of electric lights would change the experience of a trip to the fair.
Electric lighting was probably seen by most people for the first time at their local fair. They didn't have lighting in their houses. They'd been used to paraffin lamps, candles, whatever. But to go to the fairground and see for rows of bright bulbs was something remarkable.
But it was the arrival of one electric ride from America in 1928 that really caught the imagination.
The of electricity is the connectors at the top of it. How does it work? Can I get that person back? No, boom! You bash, you clash, you go around in circles, you never get where you're going.
The Dodgems caused a sensation on fairs across the country and would go on to become the most popular ride of the 20th century.
The great beauty of a ride on the Dodgem is that it is the only ride on the fairground where you are in control as the rider, the man behind the steering wheel. And this is why you fought over it as a kid, because you wanted to be there, you wanted to drive that car. And of course you were probably not old enough to have a license and drive a car on the road, but you could drive a car on the Dodgem track, and more to the point, you could bump into another car.
With the coming of electricity to the fair, the bulky steam rides of the Victorian era were replaced by electric-powered attractions like the Dodgems, which could offer a faster, more thrilling experience.
The advance of fairground rides is entirely dependent upon the technology to support them, not just the engines that drove them, but also the metals, the engineering that could actually build the rides. They are actually quite simple in concept. I mean, they all depend on arcs and circles. You either go round and round, or you go up and down, or you go up and down and round and round. But it is all based on a sort of simple concept. But the complications are introduced by the advances in technologies.
Out of this new electric age emerged many of the rides that we see today. In the years leading up to the Second World War, the Dodgems were soon followed by the Ghost Train, the Skid, the Mont Blanc, and the Speedway. At the outbreak of the Second World War, many fairs were forced to close down, and the fairground community, like everyone else in Britain, did their bit to help defend the country.
All walks of life contributed to the war effort. I mean, our community lost quite a lot of showmen fighting in the war. But what the fairground community did, they got together and raised a fund to pay for an aeroplane, a Spitfire. And that Spitfire was called the Fun of the Fair.
The women operated the fairs. They raised within 9 months £4,000 purely from the showmen to buy a Spitfire for the nation. Because they didn't have any money, the government didn't have enough Spitfires. So £4,000 they raised, and we're rightly proud of that.
The years following the end of the Second World War would see the fairground reach the peak of its popularity in Britain, with people keen to enjoy themselves after 6 years of conflict.
The post-war years were a particularly good time on the fairground. We'd emerged from war somewhat hard up. It was the age of austerity. There was rationing, but there was more or less full employment. So people were in work, they had money, but they had very little to spend it on because of rationing. So the entertainment industry in general, whether it be the theatre, the cinema, the fairground or the circus, the holiday camps, did extremely well. It was a very busy time for showmen.
But the fair was changing. Victorian favourites like the freak shows were on the wane, in line with new social attitudes.
I can give you the reason in a nutshell. 20 years ago, there was plenty of fat ladies, tattooed ladies, armless men, midgets, dwarfs, etc. But in those days, the people were poorer, and they were only too happy to have their children earn a living, and that was how the showmen came together and put them on exhibition. But today, in a welfare state, you never hear anything at all about these people.
Through the 1950s, freak shows were replaced in popularity by Wild West shows. One of the most famous Wild West show families in 50s Britain was the Shufflebottoms. Florence began performing in her father's show from the age of 13.
As I grew up after the Second World War, I was 13 and I joined my father with their little sideshow that they had. And I used to stand for my father to do the shooting and the knife throwing. And I did love dancing. I love dancing now, but I can't. My knees are gone.
The Shufflebottom family had been presenting their Wild West show for 3 generations. Legend had it that Florence's great-grandfather was a cowboy who came to Britain in the 1880s with the popular American showman Buffalo Bill.
Buffalo Bill came over to England in 1880s, and according to the family story, Texas Bill came over with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, but I don't think I've ever heard of an American cowboy called Shufflebottom.
More like the real tale is that he came from Lancashire because his name was Shufflebottom, and that is a Lancashire name. And do know for a fact that he worked for Buffalo Bill, because in my grandfather's day, everybody had horses, and he was very good with horses, I believe.
Then he had 10 children, and each of them had a Wild West show. And my favourite one was the Colorados and the Florence Shufflebottom. Her father was known as Ricardo Colorado.
Florence was such a skilled performer that she soon became the celebrity face of the fairground in the 1950s.
And the smash hit musical, Annie Get Your Gun, was on at the West End, and we went to see it. So, of course, doing the sharpshooting and wearing these costumes and Annie Get Your Gun being popular, I got a lot of publicity out of that because I was known as the British Annie Oakley.
Anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
She could do Wild West, she could do sharpshooting, she could do knife throwing. Any showman over a certain age will go weak in the knees when you talk about Florence Shufflebottom. She was the pin-up girl, such an amazing performer.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
But my father wanted me to do the sharpshooting, and I didn't really want to do it because I didn't like firearms then, and I don't like them now, but I wanted to help my father. It made it easier for him. And he trained me to do the shooting.
But Florence's career as a Wild West sharpshooter ended after an accident during one performance.
And I was very good at it, although I say so myself, I was very good at it. I was very confident until one day when I had an accident, and it wasn't my fault. And I shot my mother in the finger knuckle. She was holding 3 pipes in a spray fashion like that against the target board. And I was laid down on the floor and I had to shoot that way. Now, the rifle I was using was a pump-action rifle. And as you did that, the empty cartridge, the empty shell went over your shoulder. And a little boy in the audience jumped up to catch it, knocked me, and the rifle came off, and the bullet went through my mother's knuckle. And from that day on, I lost my confidence. I really did. I knew I could do it, but I didn't enjoy it anymore. Where before I used to enjoy performing, I didn't enjoy doing the shooting.
There's no business like show business.
But this accident didn't dent Florence's fairground career, as she soon began performing with live snakes.
You'll be appearing.
We had 3, actually. We had a small one and 2 big ones. We used to take the small one out the box and show it to the audience, then put it round me. And most people would go, oh, you know, snakes, you know. And when they got used to seeing you with a small snake, then you'd go and pick up the big snake. Well, they was really amazed at that. And then I used to finish the performance by doing what they call the kiss of death. Now, I never, and if you look at all the photographs you have of me, I never held a snake's head like that. I always let the snakes be free, had my hand underneath the snakes, and they got that they used to do it of their own accord. I used to stand like that and open my mouth, and they put their head in my mouth, and that was called the kiss of death, and that used to finish my performance.
On with the show.
While Florence was thrilling 50s crowds, the sights and sounds of the fairground around her were about to be revolutionized by the arrival of rock and roll.
Rock and roll was made for the fairground.
And it was the only place really you could hear loud rock and roll for absolutely nothing.
And you have a sort of unholy alliance between youth and bright lights and things going fast and popular music.
It was not a place for your parents' music. It was your music. In the 1950s, it was rock and roll. It was hand in hand with the idea of Teddy Boys, with the beginnings of youth culture, with youth fashions that was happening in the post-war period. Kids had money to spend and they could go and spend it wherever they wanted, and the fairground was an essential part of that ostentation.
And with the fairground, you've got this amazing arena for all of this, because you've got the technology that can pump this stuff out, but you've also got a stage upon which mods and rockers can come and preen and exhibit themselves, you know, stand under flattering electric light.
They say the joint was rocking, going round and round. Yeah, reeling and rocking. What a crazy sound.
The coming of rock and roll led to the birth of Britain's first youth culture. And with fairgrounds reverberating to the new music, the fair now seemed to belong to teenagers.
Rose out of my seat, just had to dance.
I can remember seeing my first teddy boys at a fairground and being absolutely fascinated by this idea of the exotic other with the Edwardian velvet collars and the cowboy bootlace ties. These were the people our parents warned us about, and we wanted to be them. They were so magnificent, peacocks in their splendour as they paraded through the crowds of people.
Throughout the 50s and 60s, fairgrounds became a place where boys and girls would go to meet.
It's very hard for us to imagine these days, but there were very, very few places for courting in the 1950s. And the fair would arrive as this zone of liberty. And young couples could go there, not to transgress particularly, but just to shout at one another, to eye one another up, to do la marcha. The girls would walk down one side, the boys would walk down the other. You'd eye each other up. Fashions would be spotted.
Our October fair was the high point of the school year. You had to have a boyfriend for the fair. You couldn't go on your own. If you went with a girl, if you went with your best friend, you'd sort of failed.
There's a sort of sexual charge about the fairground too, because it's the kind of place where boys and girls might get together away from the parental eye, you know, go down the tunnel of love or up on the Ferris wheel. You know, your dad can't see what you're doing up there. And where young people go in packs and gangs and can face each other off.
By the 1960s, new rides had arrived at the fair, which added to the youthful edginess of the whole fairground experience.
Boom, 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 boom. Gonna shoot you right down.
There were rides really which originated in the United States. There was a ride called the Dive Bomber, which set you through 360 degrees.
Boom, 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 boom.
And the Ferris wheel became very popular after the war, made by an American company. If you think of a big wheel or this dive bomber, it was a teenage boy and girl situation. You took your girlfriend up there, or the ghost train, you took your girlfriend in there.
And you hoped that boys would take you on a scary ride, because then that would give them the excuse to put their arm around you to make sure you didn't fall out.
The idea of a girl being frightened next to you as you come down, whoomph into the water flume or up on the big one. The word the big one, come on, who are we kidding? We know what this is about. You've made out, you've copped, you've got to first base, you've done whatever, because it's an area where anything goes. It's a no man's land, it's a ground zero of emotions. And they were also areas that were considered quite dangerous by boys because you could go into a fight with another gang. Or the girl you fancied might go off with a fairground boy. The romanticism of the gypsy and Gypsy Davy. Late last night when the squire came home looking for his lady, but she's gone off with the raggle-taggle gypsies. Oh, why do you leave your goose-feather bed? All for the love of Davy.
It was late last night when the boss come home, is asking about his lady. The only answer he received, she's gone with the Gypsy Davy, gone with the Gypsy Davy.
Well, you see, like you see him walking around, and you look at a few, and you know, they look a bit, they've got some money or something like that. Well, you don't bother with them. You look for the ones that's going around a bit poor looking, you see. Then you got more chance with them. You know, a bit rough looking. You know what I mean?
Bit rough now, what do you mean?
Well, they don't go. No, you see some going around, they wouldn't speak to you, look at you, or anything like that. You know, if you call them over to anything, and they just look at you and like that and walk away again. But if they come over, well, then you know you're on the summit there, you see. They start chatting to you.
There in the light of the camping fire, saw her fair face beaming, her heart in tune with the big guitar, and the voice of the gypsies sang in that song of the Gypsy Day.
And they were always so cool. They'd be there in the middle of the dodgems going round, and they'd be leaning there, looking for all the world as if they owned it. And they'd walk out as the dodgems were going around. If I'd walked out, I would have fallen flat on my face. But they'd come out and they'd lean on a dodgem as the girls were there. And they knew what they were doing.
But this was the high tide of fairground popularity. Fairs continued to travel the country, but through the 1970s, other attractions emerged that began competing for teenage time and money. While the rides and the candy floss remained, the sideshows went the way of the boxing booths and disappeared. In the 1980s, a new style of entertainment from America pitched up in Britain. Theme parks were the ultimate in white-knuckle rides. Places like Alton Towers quickly became among the most popular tourist attractions in the country. But these high-tech amusements also drew a low-tech response in the form of vintage fairs, which tapped into a now growing feeling of nostalgia for the traditional fairground.
Nowadays with the fair, people have a nostalgia for a type of fair, and I think that the best example of the kind of really beautiful, perfect, ideal fair that people think of from their childhood, and now we're all getting older, is the fair that the Carter family, Carter Steam Fair. Which Steam Fair is not, it's actually Carter's Fair because they've got anything from the 1900s to the 1950s on their fair. All the equipment is beautiful, it's impeccably looked after. But they're only like those entrepreneurs and showmen from 100 years ago who came into the community and added something new to it.
Today, crowds are attracted to Carter's Steam Fair for the experience of being taken back in time to the golden age of the fairground.
We give the public a much more novel experience because our rides, some of them are steam driven, so they're ranging from 1895 right through to rock and roll. So they come along and, I mean, it's been described as more like a film set than a fun fair. But they can ride on everything, and we play old music, and I mean, it's just like going back into the past, really. And we're very non-aggressive, so we attract families, and we just like to give them a really good old-fashioned experience. What fun was like before it got too technical.
Now it's become part of the nostalgic world of the fairground, so that the steam fair is now something where, you know, it's almost like going to a farmer's market or something like that, where middle-class people might go to buy posh cheeses. Here they go to, you know, to put their children on little wooden ducks that go up and down, and enter this absolutely staggeringly beautiful painted world that's been commuted out of the 19th century and has somehow been allowed to survive into the 21st.
For over 200 years, travelling fairs have brought their special magic to towns across Britain. Through innovation and invention, the fair's characters, shows and rides created our first popular entertainment industry. And there are still 4,000 show families putting on around 200 fairs a week. As ever, the allure of the fairground lies in the way it arrives in our midst and then, just as suddenly, disappears.
Say goodbye, my one true lover.
I think the idea of fairs being transitory, they're not illusory because they've happened and you might have the goldfish. Or your girlfriend might have run off with the Dodgems guy. But you've been there and you've taken part in this thing that's disappeared. And there's something quite magic about that. You've been there, you've taken part in it, and it's disappeared. The next day there's just this little muddy field where things had been. They've packed up their tents and gone into the night.
It was the marks in the grass and the rings in the grass. The rings appear, the fair's there, and then they go, and as they vanish, and then they grow back again just in time for the fair to come again.